For this week, the goal with the lab, guys, is that you guys are going to, once again, go to the rec center and you're going to pick an exercise where you're going to build up to the true heaviest load you can only do for 1 rep. You can use a compound exercise. I would avoid something like the leg press just because the amount of reps you can do and the loads you can attain can just be honestly comical. And instead, what I want you guys to go ahead and do is just, pick an exercise, build up to a true full 1 rep max. Be careful, take plenty of times in the warm-ups. You can see that on the methodology inside of the sheet. And then from there, you're going to go ahead and take and drop down 80% of that 1 rep max you just attained and do as many reps as you can. And really take it to complete concentric failure, controlling the weight the entire time. Then you're going to take another 3 to 5 minutes break, go down to 60% of that max, do as many reps as you can, and then take another long break, drop down to 40% of the max, and rep out as many times as you can. It's going to be tiring. It's meant to not be easy, but your goal is to figure out, how many reps can you really attain at different percentages of your 1 rep. So we're going to then look at those relationships and see how they, are initially kind of strong and how maybe they break down when we get to much greater percentages of your max. So then on Friday, you're going to come to lab. We're going to go ahead and put all that data into a happy little computer. And then we're going to go ahead and talk through what we saw. So that way you guys can go ahead and see that relationship that did or did not occur thanks to the wonderful reps to fatigue. So make sure, once again, you're doing that lab on your own outside of class. And then whenever you guys get here, we're going to be able to go through all of the data that you guys came up with and look at those relationships. Pick something that's not going to upset your joints. Pick something that, once again, you can do through a full range of motion and that you give yourself plenty of time to warm up, especially when you're doing that true max on it. I don't want you guys hurting yourselves. Take your time. Okay. Any questions over effectively your goals for doing the lab this week? Any questions there? No questions at all. Can you guys hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, thank you. Sometimes I feel like I'm talking to myself. So we left off talking about fatigue. So specifically, we're now talking about the different types of fatigue. The first type of fatigue we're going to see is going to be depletion of our phosphocreatine stores. This is going to be from really brief, but really high intensity exercise. So hence, whenever you're trying to do maximal sprinting, you're going to be using ATP, which is going to be going into ADP, and we will immediately replenish that with the phosphate from phosphocreatine, thanks to the enzyme creatine kinase CK. Now that's why we're going to deplete that phosphocreatine really, really rapidly. And so once we go ahead and deplete those phosphocreatine stores, now our fastest energy production, or that energy system, is effectively not able to contribute enough anymore. So we're left with anaerobic glycolysis, aerobic glycolysis, and beta oxidation. Now, this isn't really going to be so uncomfortable, but remember, now that we no longer have this higher amount of power output, forced output, we're not going to be going as fast, we're not going to be hitting as hard, we're not going to be as explosive, because those biggest fibers that really kind of specialize in this energy system are not going to be able to keep up that output, because they're just literally not going to have the ATP to go ahead and do so. Now, the next key component that we're going to have for why we're going to have a decrease in performance is going to be going into more longer duration, and that is going to be depletion of muscular glycogen. Now, glycogen, remember, is that storage form of glucose inside of the muscle in fast twitch and slow twitch fibers. We don't have a lot of it, and whether we're doing a lot of anaerobic glycolytic work, so we're doing a lot of 300-yard shuttles, doing a lot of gassers, doing a lot of really intense brief sprints, we're going to be depleting that glycogen. However, it's more likely we're going to get this massive depletion of glycogen when we're doing things of moderate to relatively low exertion, aka long distance aerobic style training, where we're going to see this depletion of glycogen going to be related to literally how uncomfortable we're feeling with that training, until eventually we're not going to be able to keep up that work output. So Once again, we have that finite amount of glycogen in our cells. Once that accumulates, we're not going to be able to keep up our performance. Now, we are going to use a lot more glycogen initially just because we're still getting all of our aerobic systems to kind of be turned up to effectively their best ability. And specifically, we're going to see that the aerobic components take a little while to get up to speed, specifically when we're talking about utilizing beta oxidation, which is going to preserve that glycogen for even longer. Now, it's also going to come down to, once again, the fiber types we're using. So whichever fiber types we're using first and the most are going to be the ones that are using the most carbohydrates. And our type 1 fibers are more likely to have the depletion from aerobic style training, since obviously they're the ones being leaned on the most. And then our type 2s are going to be tapped into, A's specifically, when we're going to moderate intensities, and type 2Xs when we're really going into those, well, I guess moderate to high, and then really high intensities for the type 2X. So we're only going to have a finite amount of glycogen in each of them. And remember, we can't really remove glycogen into glucose and then into the adjacent cells very efficiently. Now, we can have that lactate shuttle that's going to help, and a couple other, like the Cori cycle, where we can kind of have some alanine cycling, which is going to help with gluconeogenesis, but it's more of a stopgap than it really is going to be a good way to get around this very finite energy source that we're going to be running out of. Now, the other thing to keep in mind, guys, remember, it's not just the fibers, so the fast twitch, slow twitch fibers, but it's also specifically those fibers inside of the muscles you're using given the exercise that you're doing. So when we're looking at glycogen depletion, in which areas of the bodies are going to be depleted faster than others, it's the ones that we happen to be using more. So, for example, when we happen to have somebody walking on level ground or running on level ground, running uphill and running downhill, notice that there's a much greater amount of glycogen depletion from uphill running than there is in flat ground running, and there's more or a little bit less depletion from doing the downhill running. But notice there's a difference between soleus and gastroc. Soleus, which typically is a lot more slow twitch fiber, and gastroc, which is typically more type 2 fast twitch fiber, are going to react actually differently as far as the depletion, notice, is higher for the soleus as you're going downhill compared to uphill, whereas with the gastroc and the vastus lateralis, that's the outer sweep of the quadricep, where we're going to see a greater depletion from the uphill running. Now, what we're going to find is our muscle glycogen levels are not going to be able to keep up what we're doing for long periods of time. So we're going to start to free up that glycogen from our liver so it goes into our bloodstream. Once it goes into our bloodstream, we're going to be able to get into those muscles and use it. Our liver is also going to start to undergo that glycogenolysis. That's breaking it down effectively so that we can go ahead and free it up, along with gluconeogenesis, creating new glucose over a long period of time. And so as we're depleting both the muscle glycogen and our actual blood sugar levels becoming hypoglycemic, here's where we're going to have fatigue. We're just literally not going to be able to keep up that previous level of exercise intensity. Now, these are relatively long durations. You're probably not going to have an issue with glycogen depletion because you went out for a 10, 20-minute jog. But if you're talking about going out and doing legitimate cardio or playing a sport with a pretty decent amount of intensity for over 2 hours, you're really going to run yourself into some potential issues with a glycogen depletion. So now, the reason we want to, effectively use this as a fuel is it turns out it's going to help us with breaking down fuels. And specifically, we're going to find that we want to be breaking down the glycogen at a certain rate because it allows us to maintain our NADH production in the Krebs cycle. And that in turn is going to influence the electron transport chain. So if we don't have any glycogen, we're literally going to have a slowed down breaking down of fuels through beta oxidation. It's the reason why it's sometimes referred to as fats are burned in the fire of carbohydrate. You do want to have at least a certain amount of carbohydrates in there, and you're typically only going to be able to produce energy aerobically from beta oxidation at about 2/3 of the rate you're going to be able to produce it when you're doing it through aerobic glycolysis. So if you figure you've completely bonked out, is what they'll refer to it sometimes with like long distance, like marathon running, where you've effectively depleted your glycogen, you're only going to be able to maintain a velocity of about 2/3 of your previous velocity when you're out of carbohydrates. It's also referred to as hitting the wall. Has anybody in here ever experienced that before whenever they try to do long distance training? Could have been like really, really long sport practices, maybe during 2-a-days or something along those lines, or they've tried to do a marathon themselves. When did that happen to you, Tyler? So how would you describe the sensation of hitting the wall?
I would say it literally just feels like you can't do anything at all, honestly. It doesn't really feel like just like your energy and stuff is just completely depleted.
Yeah. The best way that I could describe it in a physical sensation for you guys, aside from exactly what Tyler said, it'd be the equivalent of just walking on the sidewalk to all of a sudden you're walking in very loose sand, or you're walking in essentially a lot of really like thick mud, where just it feels like you're sinking in, and it just requires so much energy just to go at the same speed you were going just a moment ago with very little effort. So I thoroughly suggest all of you guys try to experience it at least once in your life. It's a rather sobering experience. If you guys want, I can make that a lab that you guys could go ahead and do. It just requires you to go and do some form of cardio for an insane long period of time until you feel like garbage. If you guys like the idea of doing that, don't say anything and don't make any comments, and we'll make sure we'll go ahead and have you guys do that. Yeah, Zach, it's going to mimic dehydration a little bit. And well, there we go. Getting some responses out of some of you guys. Maybe just all the ones that don't say anything, the ones that just turned on the Zoom and walked away. I'll just make this their lab, and then the rest of you guys don't have to do it because you've already voted how you don't want to have anything to do with this. Okay, so we talked about literally the loss of glycogen and the loss of phosphocreatine. The next big cause is going to be the accumulation of metabolic byproducts. So you're going to accumulate a lot of phosphorus whenever you happen to be doing a lot of energy breakdown, specifically thanks to being donated from both phosphocreatine and obviously ATP. We are going to also increase our heat. Our body temperature is going to increase pretty heavily thanks to, once again, these stressors. We're going to be producing lactate, which is going to, lactic acid is the lazy way of approaching it. You're going to produce lactate, which is going to also have a proton that comes with it. You can see that at the bottom. The lactate's not the problem. Lactate's a fuel source. You guys can take it as a supplement. In fact, it might actually have some beneficial effects. It just has a lot of negative press around it. That's why you don't see people trying to supplement with lactate salts, also because they taste like garbage. Now, the issue is that proton that comes with it. So when that proton that comes with it, you're going to go ahead and now drop the pH, which literally is going to make your blood and your muscles more acidic. When they become too acidic, literally the enzymes inside of your cells don't function like they're supposed to. Did any of you guys have an opportunity to get outside much this weekend? Specifically when we talk about heat. So how was the humidity down here in Richmond on Saturday? Because it was real high up here on up here, meaning up in Lexington, where I live on Saturday. Oh, 90% Louisville. That's even more exciting. So that's where, you start working out and then you literally just start to drip. And so it literally can be relatively difficult to thermoregulate it. I can only imagine there, Catherine. So it turns out that increased temperature is going to cause some duress of the body. That's where we start risking different forms of heat illness that can occur. Anything from heat cramps to heat exhaustion, and then potentially heat stroke if we really do a bad job of controlling everything that's going on. So our total amount of heat is going to influence our metabolic rate. So as our temperature goes up, we're actually going to shift to more carbs and fuel, so we're going to deplete our glycogen faster. And obviously, once that glycogen is depleted, boom, we've got ourselves into an issue. Temperature gets high enough, literally our muscles are not going to function like they're supposed to. We're going to be more likely to have issues with cramping. So what we're going to find is most individuals are actually going to be able to maintain and perform better at what we used to be a lower temperature. That's why you see like a lot of cross-country athletes, even though they're, you know, relatively slighted build individuals, they typically prefer to race in 50-degree weather as opposed to having to go out even on a 70-degree weather, which is usually relatively comfortable for just about, you know, all of us from living in this general area. Because once you start exercising, you're going to have all that extra energy turnover, which is going to be increasing that core temperature. So if you're in a colder environment, you're going to be able to maintain for much longer. So we do know the ambient temperature is going to influence your performance. And obviously this is part of the reason why practice times and scheduling might try to alter things so athletes aren't out in the essentially the hottest part of the day in the summer, since it's going to be increasing the risk of those heat related injuries, along with it's just going to require, it's going to make things much more difficult to essentially be able to exercise at the high of enough intensity that you really want to get the performance you're looking for. So that wonderful lactate that's accumulated, it's going to have that wonderful proton that comes with it. It's the pH that's going to be the issue. Once we go ahead and drop that pH too low, literally enzymes inside of our cells don't work like they're supposed to. Glycolysis starts to shut down because the enzymes don't work because they essentially, they fold, and their folding naturally gives them certain abilities. Whenever you increase the pH, it causes them to unfold, so they start to lose their specificity and hence their functionality. And so once we get our pH down low enough, it doesn't matter how hardcore you try to be, you're not going to be able to keep that up. And that's also why we care about active recoveries after hard exercise as a means to get our athletes ready to go faster than if we were just having to finish a really hard bout and then just hang out. So remember, lactate itself is not just a end-all be-all bad thing. It is a good source of fuel. So as long as our clearance, the size of our drain, is as big or bigger than essentially how fast we're filling the tub with, we're going to be okay, because we can utilize this as an energy source aerobically anywhere in the body, from the brain to the type 1 muscle fibers to the heart itself. All of those are going to be able to use lactate as a fuel. And we're going to be able to shuttle it literally from the type 2 fiber into the type 1 fiber adjacent, so it can be used as fuel. Along with it can even go to the liver and then effectively be converted back into glucose via that gluconeogenesis. So it's only when we're starting to, once again, fill the bathtub faster than we can drain the bathtub, we're essentially producing lactate faster than we can clear it, that's where we're going to run ourselves into issues. Otherwise, we should be more than fine. Now, some interesting other forms of fatigue is actually going to be a neurological, where literally we are not able to send enough signal to get that muscle to contract. This could be because we're not able to produce enough acetylcholine or release enough acetylcholine to get an actual action potential. It could be because we have altered breakdown of acetylcholine in the synapse. So it's breaking it down much more rapidly, so we're not going to be able to get a full action potential generated. It could be because our stimulating threshold effectively starts to creep up, so it requires more to depolarize. And it might be issues with a altered resting membrane potential. So it's becoming hyperpolarized. So once again, it's even more difficult to get it to that point where it's going to go ahead and depolarize. Notice I use the term maybe a lot here, because all of these things can be contributing. The degree of which each is not fully understood yet through science. And then effectively how alterable these are going to be from different types of training stimulus, once again, are not fully understood. So we definitely know that as far as just misery, yeah, I mean, that was probably a combination of both heat stress and then a lot of volume. And then as far as, yeah, I know what you're talking about, Zach,
Okay.
Yeah, so Zach joined me to do some squatting in my garage. And you guys are welcome to come join if you want. It's not really that exciting. It's just heavy safety squat bars in a garage. And so when he and I were lifting, he was doing great work. He gave great effort, and he was getting very tired, as you'd expect from doing a lot of squatting. And he was having a hard time keeping up his output. And if you watched him lift, you could see how his velocity and power was going down, simply because a lot of his type 2 fibers. Now, these are two different things that were causing fatigue. One is the fact that he's got the muscle mass, but he doesn't have the metabolic energy production side of it to keep up that work output. So that's kind of an energy systems issue. And then secondarily, because of all the work he was doing, it was probably accumulating more damage onto those muscle fibers than they were previously prepared for. And because of that, once again, couldn't produce the energy he needed to get his muscle to contract like he wanted to, so he'd be able to keep up his work output. So yes, that is definitely a factor there, Zach, as far as how much and it being an end-all be-all. I wouldn't, put all the eggs in one basket and say it was simply because of, just this or just that, but I would definitely say all of these had a part to do with it. And so if we are fatigued, the end of it is the final effect is we cannot get those fibers to contract like we want to. So it could be because of just the neurological component, literally just trying to get the muscle depolarized, some issues with the initial depolarization, and then it could even be further in trying to get calcium to be released from calsequestrin from the sarcoplastic reticulum so that it can then go bind to that troponin to get that muscular contraction to occur. So another interesting effect is the actual central nervous system. So now we're talking about the brain and the spinal cord, where this gives itself to what's known as the central governor theory, which is like anything else, the stress that we're putting on our body through exercise might be too much for the body to deal with. So both consciously and subconsciously, we are literally unwilling to endure more pain. And because of this, our body is going to shut us down. So hence, fatigue that, it feels uncomfortable, I don't enjoy it. That's a warning sign that our body is giving us that like, yeah, whatever you're doing is very stressful. And we don't want to keep this up for really long periods of time. So we might literally have effectively, physiologically, might be able to be pushed further, but neurologically, our brain is acting like a governor on the engine. It's telling us like, no, you're not allowed to do that much more because you might hurt us. And if we are hurt, we're not going to be able to do the things that we're really looking to do. That's why you've probably heard of people working out so hard, they passed out, they threw up, but rarely do you ever hear about a healthy athlete, not someone that has some genetic anomaly with their heart or otherwise, an athlete literally working themselves to death. Yes, there's things that happen thanks to heat illness and injury because they're working on too warm of environments. There are some other confounding factors like the sickle cell trait that have obviously occurred, but the true working yourself to death is incredibly rare because the brain is trying to keep you alive. It's not trying to keep you happy, unfortunately, but it's there to keep you alive. And since that's its major goal, it's going to effectively try to calm you down or shut you down before you ever get to that point. And so elite athletes are arguably better at both being able to tolerate a greater amount of discomfort and be able to pace themselves at a much better rate so that they aren't going to be fatiguing out as rapidly. Whenever I say governor on an engine, please, do you know what that means? So just like in the polling, tell me yes or no if you understand what a governor on the engine means. Okay, so it looks like a lot of us don't know what a governor on an engine is. Okay, Tyler, if you know what it is, go ahead and explain it to the class, bud. Okay, so the basic idea of a governor on an engine is what the computer for that car is only going to allow you to get the car's speed only up to a certain amount of miles per hour, or to get the RPMs up to a certain level. Anything you try to do after that, it will literally back you down. So have any of you guys had a chance to drive like a really big moving van? A really big moving truck? Maybe you had to use one when you were coming to school or otherwise. So Cody, did you ever notice if you tried to get the van up to a certain speed, it would just, usually a lot of them won't allow you to go faster than 75 miles an hour. So as soon as you get to 75 miles an hour, it's like the gas pedal is naturally let up. It doesn't matter how much harder you push, that's as fast as you're going.
Yeah.
Bingo. That's the governor on the engine. So the basic idea is, yeah, you could make that moving truck go faster than 75 miles an hour. However, once you get it up to 80, 90, 100 miles an hour, the amount of speed of that angry rectangle effectively going through space, if you get a bad crosswind or otherwise, it might literally cause the vehicle to flip just because of all of the drag that's occurring with it. So a governor on an engine is a good thing because A, it protects you from pushing the engine too hard to where it might, you might blow the engine, you might injure the vehicle, or you might cause the vehicle to operate at such a speed or otherwise that once again, you might wreck not because of a lack of, skill, but because of other variables going on. So we talked about this on Friday, specifically with the vertical jump. So what were the sensory organs that we talked about on Friday that are naturally kind of working specifically as a governor on your muscles' force production so it doesn't tear your tendons? Awesome, Trendon. The Golgi tendon organ. That's going to detect that stretch on the tendon because the muscles are contracting so hard that it's going to tell the muscle to not contract so hard so we don't risk tearing that tendon off the bone. And that's a good thing because once you tear the tendon off the bone, unless you can get surgery, that's it. It's gone. It's no longer attached. It's not going to have the function you once had before. So when you're thinking about athletes, when you're thinking about your own training, we have a number of different neurological processes that literally work to limit what we do, which is a good thing because we don't want everybody to go 100% with absolutely no control. And because of that, we're going to be more likely to hurt ourselves because of that lack of control than if we are able to do things and slowly become more comfortable or more experienced in pushing our body to effectively what were our previously thought of limits. So we are going to be having, that improvement in performance slowly over time, but we're not going to be increasing our risk of catastrophic injury rapidly right out the gate. So does that make sense, guys, of different causes of fatigue? Awesome. Good. Are there any other questions that you guys have that you'd like me to go through before we're going to go ahead and move on to our next happy little chapter? Any other questions of things you guys would like me to go ahead and talk about before we move on to chapter 6? No? You guys are good? You guys are just exceedingly bored and barely holding on to consciousness, trying not to fall asleep? Maybe some of you have already fallen asleep. That's okay. I understand. Maybe these lectures are a little boring. I'm trying, guys. I promise I'm trying. So we're going to go ahead and talk a little bit about the cardiovascular system and how we're going to go ahead and control it. Now, when we're talking about the cardiovascular system, guys, yes, you understand the major functions. We need to get oxygen to our tissues along with nutrients. So protein, carbs, fats, minerals, vitamins, etc. We need to remove carbon dioxide and other waste products. So that's where we're going to make sure that gets shoved where it needs to in the body. We're going to transport our hormones, other molecules of interest, along with we're going to actually use our blood as a way to give us essentially temperature balance and fluid regulation throughout the body. So when we're pumping that blood around our body, it's going to be mixing and effectually helping average out the temperature throughout our areas of our body. It's going to help manage our acid-base balance, because remember, we're going to have a lot of that anaerobic byproduct of that proton that comes with the lactate from anaerobic glycolysis, which is dropping our pH. But as we keep dropping it into the bloodstream is going to work to buffer it so it doesn't drop it down too rapidly. And that's also how we're going to shuttle around a lot of our immune cells throughout the body, so they're going to have their effect. When you reach the point of hitting the wall, can you recover enough in a few minutes to go full out again at 100%, or does it take longer to get back to that ability to go that hard? So that's a good question when we're talking about energy system production. Now, Tyler, that's one of those things that's called, it depends. Now, if you hit the wall in the true, like, let's say your muscle glycogen levels are near negligible and you're effectively hypoglycemic, you could take 3 to 5 minutes, and after that period of time, your ATP PCR system should be fully replenished. So you're going to have that burst of energy of something that's going to carry you for about that, 3 to 15 second territory. Meaning, if you're going to go and do a maximal lift or a maximal throw, you have the energy to do so. Now, if you're talking about that in the context of something like cheerleading, where we're talking about a 2.5 minute full out, unless you happen to be somebody that has very, very few things they have to do during the routine, it's likely not going to give you enough energy, because you're going to blow through that ATP PCR and then being lofted up the rest of it by beta oxidation. So you're not going to be able to keep up your work output. Now, what you could do with your athletes, or yourself, if you're hitting that wall, is to be making sure you're consistently drinking a beverage that has glucose and fructose in it, along with some salt, some sodium specifically, because that's going to go obviously into the bloodstream and help bring your blood sugar levels up, which will then be pulled into those muscles that need it, and at least is going to give them a little bit more glucose available for energy inside of the cell. But I wouldn't be confident with saying it was going to be enough to buoy you through those true full outs. Now, that same amount of glucose, if you were to go and do something like a marathon, it's going to, especially if you start that before you hit the wall, and you're making sure, same thing with those workouts, that you're supplementing with carbohydrates during your workouts, you're going to be depleting your glycogen inside of your muscle cells at a slower rate, which is going to essentially lengthen out the point in time before you hit that wall. So that can greatly help your performance and decrease the downhill slant to it, but it's not going to be kind of a panacea and make it so that you're not going to have those issues in the first place. So, the key with glycogen is your carbohydrate intake, and specifically making sure you're doing so immediately post-exercise. Doing that is going to help get that glycogen to resynthesize at a faster rate, and making sure that you're just taking in carbohydrates effectively every 4 hours or so after that workout consistently until effectively your next major practice. And then doing it again after that practice, that's going to help you essentially push that fatigue off. Because the sad thing is, once that fatigue hits, it's going to take some quality time to recover from it. So the goal in the first place is think of it along the lines of when you're working with any athlete. The goal isn't to see how fast we can essentially get an athlete back from ACL surgery and rehab. Our goal is to not get the ACL torn in the first place. Because if we can keep it from being torn, we don't lose all of that time due to the injury and then due to the recovery period. So the ounce of prevention is worth a number of pounds of the cure. Does that answer your question? Which is a good question. Cool. So the way to think of your cardiovascular system, guys, is it really comes down to 3 major components, okay? 3 different components. The pump, which is your heart. The pipes, which are your blood vessels, such as your arteries, arterioles, capillaries, venules, and veins. And then we have the fluid itself, and that is your blood. Each of these 3 adapt in their own way to training, which is important to understand. The heart and the blood are both general. The heart pumps the blood everywhere, the blood goes everywhere. So they're general. The capillary changes, the arterial changes, the venular changes is specific to the areas that we're using. So we need to think of it as those three individual components, and each has obviously their own purpose and their own way of changing to make you a better athlete. The capillaries and otherwise change specifically, so that's why specificity, what we're doing in our sport, really matters. Whereas as long as you're doing cardio, you're improving your heart health and you're probably improving your blood, we'll call it your blood profile, hematocrit and otherwise. So our heart develops pressure to pump that blood out of the ventricles each time, specifically the left ventricle, which then is going to be pumped into the aorta, and now it's time to go throughout the body. And we're going to increase blood flow to the areas of the body that need it and decrease blood flow to the areas of the body that don't need as much blood when we're exercising. So hopefully you guys remember your basic anatomy of the heart. I am not going to bother going through with you guys because you've all had physiology and anatomy, so this should be old hat. Okay, as far as the blood flow and how we're going to be moving from one area to the next, make sure that you understand our basic valves, we understand our basic locations, and we understand the importance of why valves function the way they do and how they're going to make sure that blood flow is effectively one way. Now, what's interesting about the myocardium, the actual muscle of our heart, is it is going to be all type 1 muscle fiber. And we're going to find that the left ventricle has the greatest and the thickest amount because that's where we have to pump the blood out of the heart to make sure it goes to the rest of the body. And we're going to find that it hypertrophies with both exercise and disease, but the way it hypertrophies is different. So when we talk about the ventricle itself, we can hypertrophy in that we can make the chamber bigger, or we can hypertrophy as we can make the muscles thicker. Now, when we're doing long distance, like aerobic style training, we're going to find we're going to literally make that vessel bigger. That is what's known as eccentric hypertrophy of the heart. The heart literally expands in size so that we can get more blood into it with each beat. What we're going to have with disease, like hardening of the arteries and otherwise, we're going to see that we're going to increase sometimes the muscle thickness of the heart, but we're not actually increasing its size. And this is obviously not a good adaptation because now, yeah, we have a thicker myocardium, but we aren't pumping more blood per beat. We're having to deal with more pressure load work as opposed to volume load work. So we want to make sure that when we're talking about, yes, your heart is different. Sometimes if any of you guys go to the doctor and you have to have an EKG ran or something along those lines, they might say like, oh, you have a strange EKG. Well, you're being compared to an average person. The average person is effectively Homer Simpson. So if you're in really good condition, your heart is going to actually be different than your average person's. So for example, when I was in the hospital with my brain injury, they hooked me up to an EKG because effectively, getting back to the neurological part, my sympathetic nervous system was really, really misfiring. So it would cause just epinephrine dumps, which would just shoot my heart rate way up, and then it would come down and shoot up and come down, shoot up and come down because things were misfiring, and it was very uncomfortable, as one would suspect. And so my initial complaint was like, I don't know what a heart attack feels like, but this is weird, and we should probably get this checked out. So go in, and they hook me up to an EKG. My resting heart rate, literally when laying down, will oftentimes drop into literally 40 beats per minute, and sometimes even as low as the high 30s, just because thanks to doing a large volume of work and training, my heart's a little bit bigger and more effective than other people's. And so their alarms would go off anytime my heartbeat, I believe, got under, it would be somewhere in the 40s or somewhere in the 40 beat per minute range. Anytime it dropped below maybe 45, an alarm would go off, which was really annoying because that's where my heartbeat goes when I fall asleep. So every time I started to fall asleep with my brain injury, a nice loud alarm would go off next to the bed, waking me up. As you can tell, it was a great time. So it's okay to have what's known as bradycardia, a lower resting heart rate, as long as that's due to adaptations from consistent aerobic style training. So when I said it's type 1 fiber, It's because our heart should only be aerobic. Anytime your heart goes anaerobic, that's what's known as a heart attack. And that's a very, very bad thing. So not only does it have our type 1 myosin inside of the cell, it's also going to have a huge amount of capillaries around it, and it's going to have a huge amount of mitochondria, because obviously it's trying to maintain all this energy production with only aerobic breakdown of fuels. Now, what's really interesting and different about cardiac muscle fibers compared to other muscle fibers is they are what's known as they're connected to what's known as intercalated discs. This literally allows the action potential to jump from one muscle fiber to the next via what's known as gap junctions. That's why when your heart depolarizes, it contracts fully each time. It can't do like a muscle, skeletal muscle, where we can contract just a few fibers in an entire muscle. Every time you contract your heart, the entire musculature of your heart is going to contract and relax each time. It's not going to be just one specific region only doing a X amount of work. It's always going to be that all or nothing response. And we're going to find that these cells are held together by one another through what's known as desmosomes. And these are going to be proteins that are on the sarcolemma, which is going to allow them to effectively be held together so they have this function. Does that make sense to you guys? Awesome. So our cardiac muscle fibers have some similarities with skeletal muscle, but they're going to be different in a number of ways. One is, it turns out we are not under control of our heart. Now, there's some ways we can kind of trick that system to increase our heart rate and decrease that heart rate through getting into our sympathetic nervous system and parasympathetic nervous system. It requires obviously some focus and effort, but you can effectively help both increase and decrease your heart rate. We're going to also find that the myocardial cells only have one nucleus. Remember, we have that multinucleation of skeletal muscle, and that's part of the positive adaptation of training, where we're going to be able to get those satellite cells to fuse to the damaged skeletal muscle cells, which is in turn going to help us have greater protein turnover, hence faster recovery, be able to build more muscle. And we're going to find that calcium is actually going to be part of the release of calcium from the sarcoplastic reticulum. So calcium helps create what's known as a plateau potential, which is a much longer and gives you that full contraction each time of the cardiac muscle fiber, as opposed to calcium is released and you have that sodium and potassium that's going to be coming into and out of the cell appropriately for muscular contraction, which is going to occur very rapidly. So hence we can get twitches from our skeletal muscle. We can't get that from our cardiac. We're going to have those plateau potentials. We also are going to have what's known as autorhythmicity. So our heart is literally causing itself to contract. This is by what's known as leaky channels and gives us what's known as a pacemaker potential. That thanks to sodium naturally leaking into the channel, specifically in our SA node, sinoatrial node, what we're going to find eventually enough sodium is going to leak in that we're going to hit that threshold, it's going to depolarize, and then it causes all the cells around it to depolarize, and that's your heartbeat. And that's normal, that's healthy, that's absolutely what we want. That's not what you want in your skeletal muscle, where just randomly they keep going off throughout the entire day. That would obviously be really uncomfortable, and it would make it pretty hard to sleep if you just found yourself just twitching for effectively no reason, especially one beyond your own control. So here's another graphical example so you can see that essential branching you're getting with your cardiac muscle cells compared to your skeletal muscle cells, and then those differences in how they are going to look compared to one another. Now, what's really important is obviously our heart likes to do everything aerobically, so we need to make sure that we've got really good blood supply to it, and this is going to be being supplied by our right and left coronary arteries that are going to be supplying blood throughout the entirety of the heart. Now, what's really interesting, guys, if you look at that picture on your right, you can see the point where we have what's known as an anastomosis. And this is where we have a junctioning of vessels on both sides. So we literally have blood flow coming from both directions. This is a great thing because with training, specifically aerobic training, you're going to be able to increase the amount of anastomosis. You're going to have interception and branching of your capillaries and arterioles, which literally means you're going to have more blood supply going throughout your entire heart, which literally makes your heart healthier and helps decrease your risk of something like a heart attack. Because effectively, what we're looking to do is think about the blood supply to your heart being like the roads going through whatever area you're in. And if the road is blocked and that's the only way you can get to that area, we can't get any more blood flow to that area. And unfortunately, that area is going to die. That's really what a heart attack is. Now, if we have one area that's blocked, but we've got 3 different other ways that we can get to that general area, yeah, we might have some discomfort. That's where we'll probably go, hopefully, to the hospital. They'll diagnose us with a blockage or otherwise, and we can have a bypass of some form and still maintain effectively our quality of life and our heart's function. And so we want to make sure that not just do we understand that we need this blood supply to the heart, but we want to have as much as we can. Now, atherosclerosis is going to be where we have the hardening of the arteries. It's going to be due to inflammation, which in turn is going to cause the accumulation of plaques to build up, which are going to be associated with cholesterol. And from there, eventually, in calcification, really, it's calcium that plays a component here, that effectively we're going to get to a point where literally we can completely block the blood flow to these different areas of the heart, and then, sadly enough, the heart no longer functions. And the same thing as far as building up that hardening of the arteries and then building a blockage. That's the mechanism also of a stroke. So once again, the heart itself is going to naturally cause itself to contract through this spontaneous rhythmicity because of, once again, those leaky channels are going to cause it to depolarize on its own. Now, each of those areas, the sinoatrial node, the atrial ventricular node, aka the AV node, the AV bundle, also referred to as the bundle of His, the Purkinje fibers, and even some of the myocardium of the ventricle, all have the capacity, all have pacemaker potentials themselves, and that they are going to have those leaky channels. The key is the one at the SA node leaks at the fastest rate. And by leaking at the fastest rate, it's going to cause your heart to depolarize first, which is going to reset the AV node, the AV bundle, Purkinje fibers, and the ventricles, so they never have a chance to cause that early depolarization of the heart. That's okay, that's normal. Now, as far as this electrical signal spreading throughout the heart by the gap junction, we naturally have a resting heart rate of about 100 beats per minute. This is going to be going down thanks to parasympathetic tone from that vagal nerve, which is going to suppress our heart rate, just like it's going to be going up thanks to the addition of epinephrine. And so what we're going to find is individuals who've actually had a heart transplant, they're going to have a resting heart rate pretty much of 100 beats per minute because they don't have vagal tone anymore. The heart just kind of, it's beating, but it doesn't have anything to slow it down. It only has still the sympathetic nervous system, thanks to the hormone epinephrine and norepinephrine, to cause the heart rate to go down. Now, we've only got about a minute left today, guys. Are there any other questions, comments, concerns, of things you guys would like me to go ahead and talk about? Otherwise, I will see you guys on Wednesday. Questions, comments, concerns? Go for it. All right, so make sure you guys print off that Lab 5, get yourself ready. Remember, this week, take-home assignment number 1 is also done. Think through it thoroughly. Each of those answers should be more than one solid paragraph of writing. Make sure you're completely fleshing out your answers, taking your time, going through it, and applying what you guys have learned so far. Otherwise, guys, stay safe out there. Thank you guys for joining today, and I will see you guys